Foreign direct investment. We are getting into a territory that most people are not familiar with. So if you ask 10 of your friends what they think about foreign direct investment, probably 9 out of 10 will not even know what you're talking about. Foreign direct investment may be unfamiliar topic to most people at the academic level, but at the personal level, we kind of hear about it all the time, and many people still have very strong emotionally charged opinions about issues related to foreign direct investment. For example, when an American company builds a factory overseas, that's foreign direct investment, and that's what people can understand. When a foreign company comes and buys an American company, like when Lenovo bought part of the IBM's personal computer division, many people had strong opinions about that. So let's talk about these things today, what foreign direct investment is, how it works, what drives it, so that next time when you have to talk about it, you actually have something to say. And so let's start here with the definition of what foreign direct investment is. So foreign direct investment is an investment of substantial amount overseas that gives you control, again, substantial control over an entity, a business there. And that sounds very complicated, so let me explain to you in simple terms what this is. So portfolio investment is when you buy shares in a stock of a company, but that share that you buy is too small for you to have any meaningful control over the company. So for example, if you go online and buy some shares of Alibaba or Mercedes-Benz, it is technically an investment from your pocket into a Chinese or German company. But you do not become an investor who has a say in Alibaba's or Mercedes-Benz's policies. You are one of thousands, if not millions, of investors, so your vote sort of doesn't count. So that would be portfolio investment. But if you buy a substantial portion of the company, 15, 20% more, where you become one of the sort of significant voting members, or maybe you buy the whole company, so that would be foreign direct investment. So in more common forms, foreign direct investment would be when a company from one country opens a subsidiary, builds a factory, opens a store, a restaurant in a foreign country and runs it. So that's foreign direct investment. Or when a company from one country buys a company in another country, or maybe creates a joint venture, maybe 50-50 or whatever the percentage distribution, and becomes a full-fledged member or partner in that joint venture. So that's foreign direct investment. So basically, when you start doing business overseas, when your investment makes you a business doer, so to speak, so not just a holder of one of a million shares, but actually you have enough in that company where you can say, I am doing business overseas. So that's foreign direct investment. Now, there are two different types of foreign direct investment. There is what we call horizontal foreign direct investment and vertical FDI. And so horizontal, that's when you invest in a different country with the purpose of serving customers in that country. So for example, you go to China, you open a restaurant there, and you serve the locals there, obviously. So a good example would be, for example, McDonald's or any other restaurant chain opening a restaurant, for example, in China. Even though it may be franchised type of deal, but they would own probably either some land or some building, or at least they would be kind of co-running that business with the franchisee. And so McDonald's doing business in China, that would be horizontal investment, because in this case, the consumers are in the target country. So it's not like they would be making Big Macs in China and then shipping them to the United States to sell them. But at the same time, an American company opening a factory in China to make, for example, Apple computers and smartphones, most of them are made in China, but often with the purpose of re-exporting that to other countries, for example, back to the United States. So for example, when you buy your iPhone, if you look at what it says on the box in terms of the country of origin, it will say designed in California. And the reason it says designed in California is because they don't want to admit to you that it's actually made or assembled in China. So Apple computers, Apple smartphones are made almost exclusively by Foxconn, which has close to 1 million employees in China. And so that's where those computers are made. And so they don't want to put made in China, but it doesn't really matter in this case. The point is that even though Apple has significant presence in China, much of the product of that presence goes to other countries, including back to the United States. So that would be vertical foreign direct investment. Now, when I came to the United States for the first time in 1999, I was actually surprised about the origin of some of the products. So one product that I expected to be actually made in China, Chinese made, was, I'll tell you what it is in a second, but I was very, very surprised to see that it's not made in China. This is interesting. How come? And that product was chopsticks. So you go to a Chinese restaurant. I was in Wisconsin, my first trip to the United States. You go to a restaurant, you order Chinese food, Chinese restaurant, Chinese food. And so the chopsticks arrive, and I look at the packaging, and it says made in USA. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. I mean, of all the products, I would have expected the chopsticks, a proverbial Chinese product, to be actually made in China. And that one was made in the United States, which is not surprising. The United States has a lot of forests, a lot of lumber industry, timber. So obviously, it makes sense to make the chopsticks here. Another product that I was very surprised to see that it was actually made in China. Maybe I was very naive at that time, but I thought a product like this must be made in the United States. I mean, it must. Like I even thought maybe there is a law that requires it to be made in China. And that was the memorabilia with American flag on it. In fact, the program was an exchange program, and so we got these American flag pins. And so I look at it, and it says made in China. I'm like, whoa, this is, almost felt wrong to me. I mean, how can you make sort of an American flag in China? But apparently you can. And I guess nothing wrong with that. It's a kind of product that, yes, very suitable for outsourcing to be made somewhere else. But at that time, I thought that's very strange. But so in any case, that would have been an example of vertical foreign direct investment. Now, here is a question that I would like to ask you to see if you've been paying attention. And so let's see if you can answer it. And remember that in this case, the question will probably require some thinking. So the question goes like this. Import tariffs imposed by the government are likely to. So your U.S. government, let's say you are in the United States, your government imposes an import tariff on foreign products. Will that policy reduce horizontal FDI into the United States? Horizontal, that's when the product comes into the United States, right, with the purpose of being sold in the United States. And if so, probably an import tariff will lead to more FDI. So, for example, there is an import tariff on cars in the United States. And for that reason, many Japanese, many South Korean, many German automakers actually have factories in the United States or Mexico and Canada, which are members of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, and NAFTA, what we used to call. So yes, if you impose an import tariff, there will be more horizontal investment, not less horizontal investment, which makes answer B the correct answer, right? So now, the big questions that we want to ask when we talk about foreign direct investment, so sort of reasonable questions would be, is it good or is it bad? So is foreign direct investment good or bad? Again, as I said, FDI is a topic that many people are not really familiar with. And so when I ask this question of my students, that's where they don't immediately have the answer. But then I give them more specific questions, sort of practical, real-life related questions, and that's where students start having some answers. For example, I can ask them, is it good for America when a Chinese company buys a U.S. company? Good or bad? Or is it good for America when a Chinese company creates a new company in the United States, not buys an existing company, but creates a new one, builds a factory? Or is it good for America when a US buys a company in China, good or bad? Or when a US company, an American company, creates a new business in China, is it good or bad? Now here I use the US and China context. And so I'd like to point out that to many people, that just those two countries make the context, the question, very emotionally charged. So for example, if I was asking the same question about, for example, American company buying a company in Canada, or a German company buying a company in the United States, probably that would be a little bit less emotional for most American students. Or if I ask an American student, what do you think when a German company buys a company in France? Is it good or bad? Most of them will have no emotions at all. They will be analyzing with cold brain, so to speak. And so most likely they will be, well, let's see what the business is and let's see why they do it. What's the math? What's the reason? So in this case, obviously, it might be a whole different answer. So, but when the United States and China are by many people seen as competitors and maybe even adversaries, right? So many think, well, something's fishy going on here. I'm not sure if it's good or bad. I'm not sure if it's good when American companies invest in China. We don't want Chinese companies to take over American businesses. So it becomes a little bit more emotional. So we'll talk about those things together in a minute. So you'll know better. You'll have a framework for how to analyze these issues because they're much more complicated than they may appear at the first glance. But first, let's watch a news report that talks about a foreign direct investment project going into New York State. So let's watch.
Finding one city whose skilled labor force and business environment attracting a big foreign investor. Welcome news in Syracuse, New York, where according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 45,300 people were working in manufacturing back in 1999. Now, 10 years later, that has fallen to 29,300 people, a loss of 16,000 jobs in a decade in one town. David Lee Miller's on the ground. They're live in Syracuse, New York. David Lee, good morning to you. Tell us how Syracuse is faring in this difficult economy.
Well, interestingly, after those very dire statistics you just gave, Syracuse is actually faring pretty well. The unemployment rate here is about 8.1% according to the most recent stats, and that's better than the national average and the average for New York State. Right now, I'm speaking to you from what was once a General Motors Fisher body plant. It is an enormous building. It was over 1 million square feet. It has now been divided up. 17 different tenants occupy this building, one of which is a company called Bitzer Scroll, and we are in their facility right now. This bill, and this is the interesting part of the story, is a German-based company, and here you can see them actually making the air conditioning compressor units that they make here. The employment here started about a year and a half ago, about 3 dozen people. Things are going better than expected, and it is hoped that there will be as many as 200 people that will be employed here in the next couple of years. Joining us right now is the plant manager, Mike McKee. Mike, why Syracuse, New York? This, as I said, is a German-based company. Syracuse not known for its tropical weather and wonderful beaches. Why was this location selected?
Well, first and foremost was the availability of design engineering talent in the area, specifically with compression technology. Secondly, the manufacturing base is very strong here in Syracuse, and those resources are also available.
You had a good pool of potential employees, and you also got money from the state.
Yes, we do have a grant from Empire State Development that we anticipate receiving the first installment early next year. With the cost structure in New York State, certainly there are challenges, and for us to remain and become competitive, those incentives are critical for our future.
Thank you very much, Mike McKee. Foreign investment, a very important part of employment in the United States bill. 5.3 million workers in the U.S. are employed because of foreign investment here, and throughout the day we'll have more information on that and on other employment efforts underway. For now, I'll throw it back to you in New York.
Good deal. Thank you, David Lee. Let's get it up for Syracuse now. Hear a lot about jobs leaving this country. Good to see foreign investment coming this way to employ Americans. Thank you, David Lee. Martha, what's coming up?
All right, so a lot of things going on here in this video. One, they talk about grants from New York State to foreign companies to open shop in the state. So obviously foreign direct investment often is seen as a positive thing, as job creation. especially here we're watching an interview from 2009, right at the peak of the recession of that time. And so they're talking about how many jobs have been lost in Syracuse, New York due to the recession, and then over the past decade. And so a foreign company come in and opening a factory is seen as a very positive development. Second, it's a new company, so they're not taking over an existing company. In fact, the existing company essentially closed down, and so they have this gigantic facility being empty, and so many, including foreign companies, came to the area, opened shop, rehired some people. So it sounds like it's so good for the state that the state is willing to give them not only a grant, but also some other concessions, such as lower taxes and some other goodies to attract them to that specific area. But also from the company's point of view, so they want to open a new factory, and they would like to find a place where they can have the necessary talent, where they can have the necessary beneficial economic conditions. And so they apparently did the analysis and found that New York State would be the place to go. So interesting stuff going on here. Now, here is a question that I would like to ask you, is likely to appear on the exam. So let's see if you can answer it. So it's a definition question. So what is FDI? And answer A is a form of portfolio investment. No, it's not. A purchase of physical assets or a significant amount of ownership in a company in another country to gain some measure of management control over the company. That's clearly the correct answer. You can read the other ones, but the correct one is B here. Now, let's talk about some statistics here. So now that you know the definition of what foreign direct investment is, let's take a look at where it is, where it goes from, where it goes to. So let's take a quick look here. So here is a review of foreign direct investment in the 1980s, and then 20 years later in 1988. And so the sizes of the bubbles show you here the amount and the location of where the foreign direct investment goes. And you can immediately notice that in 1980, almost all of the foreign direct investment was going into developed countries. Most of it was going into North America, into Europe, and then some in Asia, Australia, very little in Latin America, and virtually nothing elsewhere. In fact, China was not getting anything. At that time, China was still a very closed country. Now, 20 years or 18 years later, 1998, as you can see, FDI has become much, much more prevalent. The bubbles have gotten much bigger, and there are more of them. And so Europe and North America are still major recipients, but you see a lot of bubbles, like, for example, a huge one in China already, lots of foreign direct investment going there. Japan, Korea, all of Asia, but then also a lot in South America as well. So definitely at this time, much of the foreign direct investment is going, for example, to Asia for the reason of cheaper labor. So that's the time when much of the electronics, much of the textile, much of the footwear, clothing, cars, all kinds of things like that were relocated, or production was booming in Asia, and lots of foreign direct investment was going there. So, but also for the United States, for Europe, more and more FDI was happening there for the reasons proximity to the customers, obviously. So you want to be where your customers are. And so many foreign companies were opening businesses there, but also maybe talent, maybe, more qualified, more expensive, but more qualified labor. So those are all good reasons. 2023 today. So again, it's a different type of map. Sorry, I didn't have the same one for all of these. But as you can see, again, when you look at the countries, the darker the color, the more FDI goes into the country. And so the United States still remains number one recipient. So the United States is a major recipient, so is Canada, but China now is a big recipient. Many countries in Europe, especially Northern Europe, are major recipients. So not that different from 1998. So the investment goes the same way. Some in Africa, but not as much, right? And here is another view, again, a current situation. So a couple of years ago, it's from 1919, if I remember correctly, this map. But here, the size of the country is adjusted by the amount of foreign direct investment it receives. And as you can see, some countries like the United States being the base pretty much. So all of a sudden you see some countries like the Netherlands, a tiny country by the area when you simply look on the map, but if you adjust it for the amount of foreign direct investment they get, all of a sudden it becomes a large country, quite large. China obviously is here as well. So, but then, South Korea becomes a very big recipient. Hong Kong, look at Hong Kong now. So if we count it as a separate country, it gets almost as much money as China. And again, it's technically part of China, and technically it's FDI into China, but it's going through Hong Kong. And if Hong Kong was a separate country, it would be this gigantic, country that receives almost as much as the United States and more than, for example, Brazil or some other large countries. So, all right. Now here is a numeric representation. So that's received and that's invested in other countries. So received on the left side. So the European Union would be the biggest recipient if you go by the entity. But what's interesting, so you look at the latest figures, and the Netherlands received actually more FDI last year than the United States. Very interesting, right? And so again, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of that money is sort of in the Netherlands, working in the Netherlands, although most of it does. But it's also often, companies that are registered in the Netherlands and then operate elsewhere. So the Netherlands historically has been a very entrepreneurial nation. So I highly recommend you to read the history about this country. But they've been very good at trade, very good at global trade. And so that's why, and that's, one of the reasons why so much investment goes there. Very positive economic climate. So the United States, United Kingdom, those are not surprising countries on the list as recipients. But then right next, you see Hong Kong listed as a separate country, and then China. And so each individually, they don't really receive, well, they receive a lot, but not as much. But you add the two, and you basically get $3.5 billion. And so that's a substantial amount of money per year. So that's actually would put them right behind the United States. So they would put, and then Ireland, again, a country that has very, very favorable economic climate. And so a lot of investment is going there. Singapore is an interesting one. Again, tiny island, but see it's number 8 on the list. Belgium, small country, receives a lot of FDI. Now, who does the investment? Here it's very interesting. So again, not surprising that the European Union is number 1 investor. So in this case, again, it's a whole block, it's a whole union. So that's not surprising. But then the Netherlands. So the Netherlands is both a recipient, but also an investor. So the Netherlands also invests a lot overseas. And so that's what I was telling you. So it's not like all of that movement of capital is staying in the Netherlands. They receive a lot and they also invest a lot. The United States, Germany, not surprising, but again, we think about American companies opening shops overseas a lot. But the United States is also the second recipient of FDI. So the rest of the world invests a lot into the United States. Same thing with Germany. Germany receives a lot of foreign direct investment, and Germany also invests a lot overseas. And then same thing with China. So if you separate China and Hong Kong, it looks like, well, they're still both of them quite impressive. But it gets even more impressive if you realize that it's technically one country. So now there is one thing that I would like to mention here, and that is when we look at foreign direct investment, 20, 30 years ago, much of it we thought was foreign direct investment from rich countries, so to speak, going into low labor cost countries. So basically American, German companies opening factories in, for example, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, and countries like that. And again, many people didn't like it. They thought that, factories opened in Asia, that's factories not opened in, for example, the United States. But lately, it's really not the case. It's not the prototypical foreign direct investment. Still a lot of foreign direct investment going from high labor cost developed countries into low labor cost developing countries, if I use that term. But equally much, if not more, in many cases, investment these days is going from, for example, China into the rest of the world. And so about 10 years ago, I started seeing magazine articles that would be titled something like, Australia gets Chinese money, China gets Australia. Now you see even more titles like that, but in the context of Africa. So Africa gets Chinese investment, China gets Africa. Again, sort of emotionally charged, stereotypical, but yes, China is investing a lot in the Middle East, especially in oil reserves and related businesses. In Africa, again, natural resources, but also in the United States. Some time ago, about 15 years ago, Chinese company Lenovo bought the American company, or the division of the IBM company Personal Computers. That was unusual. India bought some of the biggest brand names or brands out of Britain, such as Land Rover, Jaguar. Again, that was, many Brits were not sort of comfortable with that, or not. It's not that they were not happy about it, but for them that was something, they didn't expect to happen. And then again, it was a cause for celebration in India, so they felt like it was some sort of a, not only an economic move, but also some form of a political achievement. Anyway, now, what drives foreign direct investment? So we will talk about different theories, different factors, different explanations. And so as the first one, let's take a look at the economy, how the economy and economic vision relates to the amount of foreign direct investment. So when we look at this chart here, so that's the growth of world GDP versus FDI. And as you can see here, there is a definitive correlation, positive correlation between the two. So as you can see, when GDP is doing well, a lot of FDI is happening. So when the economic conditions are favorable, positive, the economy is booming, a lot of FDI is happening too. So a lot of companies opening shops overseas, a lot of mergers, a lot of joint ventures, a lot of acquisitions. But then look at 2008, 2009. So the global GDP goes down, the economic recession happens, and FDI goes down. So obviously companies are less comfortable opening new businesses, opening new subsidiaries, and as a result, less of that is happening. So once the economy rebounds, economic activity, including FDI, resume as well. But the two are very closely correlated, right? Now, most people agree, or most politicians at least agree, that FDI is good. FDI is seen, or at least receiving FDI is good. So FDI is basically somebody is investing in creating jobs in whatever area you're responsible for. So politicians see FDI as a job creation tool. And so usually specific countries, municipalities, states want FDI, want to attract more FDI. Although in the past, when we talked about job outsourcing, additional economic activity, especially by foreign companies, could be associated with some negative externalities, such as extra pollution, maybe some other questionable activity going on in the economic, political areas. So, but generally it's seen as positive developments because it's creating jobs. And if so, then the question becomes, how do we attract more FDI? If we assume that FDI is good, the question becomes, how do we attract FDI? And so to answer that question, we have to answer the question, well, where does most FDI go and why? So what are the things that drive FDI? If we can figure out that, maybe we can create the conditions in our country that will attract FDI. And so let's take a look at some of those conditions. So I'll first list all of them and then we'll go through them one by one. So obviously first, supply factors. So you want to have your production, for example, close to resources. And by resources, I mean whatever you need to make the product. And that could be human resources, labor cost, basically people. that will be making the product, skilled labor, but also access to the technology, as well as access to maybe raw materials. We talked last time when we talked about the use of import tariffs and quotas and other governmental regulations of international trade, as you remember. We talked about how China, for example, has been artificially limiting the exports of rare earth materials, minerals. And so one of the sort of consequences of that was that companies that need those rare minerals, they have to build their factories in China so that they can put those minerals into their products. Like, for example, neodymium into these super strong magnets that are apparently part of the smartphone. You need it for GPS or for antenna or something like that. And so obviously some of those would be, companies may be opening their shops in China, not only because the labor may be cheaper, but also access to the natural resources. Or vice versa, the video that we watched just earlier today, where the German company came to New York because they had a lot of skilled labor. So manufacturing used to be popular there, lots of it. So lots of skilled labor, companies shut down, people are still there. And so the German company capitalized on the presence of that skilled labor. So then demand conditions. So you want to open your shop where your customers are. And so that's one of the reasons why, for example, most of the Japanese brands, South Korean brands, German brands sold cars. I'm talking about vehicles. Cars sold in the United States, most of them actually would be made in the United States. For example, Mercedes, most of the Mercedes cars sold in the United States would be made in Alabama. BMW is out of South Carolina. So Toyota has factories all around the place. Honda has factories all around the place. For example, my Honda Odyssey was made in the United States, Oklahoma, if I remember correctly. My BMW is made in South Carolina. And so one of the reasons they make them here is because Odyssey and BMW X3, these are very American models. You can see them in other countries, but very uncommonly. In fact, Odyssey is probably as American as it gets. And so customers are here. They want that kind of car. Obviously, for Honda, it's better and cheaper to make them in the United States and sell them in the United States than to make them in Japan and then export them to the United States. Political factors such as avoidance of trade barriers. Again, talking about cars, we have import tariffs on most cars in the United States. So many automakers not only want to be close to the consumer, but also to avoid paying taxes, import tariffs. So it's cheaper for them to have the factories right here, or at least within the free trade zone that Canada, Mexico, and the United States are members of. And then taxes. Sometimes it may be just more favorable economic climate. Taxes, regulations, so you want to be where those are lower. And so again, for many companies, the United States may seem like a good choice. Now, in terms of specific theories that explain foreign direct investment, let's take a look here at one that you may remember from the previous lectures. And this is international product life cycle theory. Remember, we talked about how, depending on the maturity of the product, it may determine in which country the product is made. And so we used personal computers as an example. And in the 80s, when the personal computers were a novel product, and only or mostly just the United States knew how to make them, much of the production of computers was happening in the United States. And so American companies didn't invest in other countries, and some countries that were related to the IT industry tried to set up shop in the United States. But then as the product started maturing, started becoming more first mature and then standardized. So when it became a product that anyone can make, and so there was no need to be any more close to skilled labor or close to a specific market, then it became more favorable, advantageous to build your factory where cheap labor is. And so that was the time when we saw many American companies like Dell, like HP, like Apple, opening their factories in Asia. And so when we say opening their factories, in some cases that means that they just outsourced some of the production. But in many cases, that means literally building factories in Asia. For example, Dell Computers were making their computers in, I think, the Philippines. for a long time, and they actually built their own factories. So they didn't hire a third party. They actually built their own factories. And so all of that was foreign direct investment. Now, taxes. Taxes is a big factor, and you obviously want to be where taxes are low. And so let's take a look here at how the tax rates vary across countries. So here on this chart, you have both personal and corporate taxes. So the purple line is the personal taxes. And as you can see here, the United States is actually not bad at all. The personal tax in the United States is not as low as in some countries, like in South Korea, in Mexico. It's like 12, 15, 18%, very low. But in the United States, all in all, we are talking about, if you factor in all of the components, it's about 28%. So state tax, federal tax. So depending on which state you are in, depending on your tax bracket, but you will be paying around 30%, maybe a little bit less in personal taxes. But when you look at some countries like Belgium, Germany, France, so European countries, more than half of your income will be paid as tax on your personal income. Huge difference. But for the companies, they don't care that much about the personal taxes. They care more about corporate taxes. And again, here you see a huge difference from a little over 10% in Ireland, like 12, 13% in Ireland, all the way to about almost 40% in Japan. And it used to be in the United States. It used to be 35% federal tax on corporate income tax, and you add to that the state taxes, and you were almost at 40% corporate tax in the United States. So, but then, as you know, in 2018, we had a new tax code go into the effect under the Trump administration. And so one of the changes at that time was that the U.S. corporate tax, federal corporate tax, went down from 35 to 21%. And so on this chart, it would be now 21, which puts the United States not in the cheapest category, because again, you still have some state taxes and some other taxes, but it would be very competitive globally. So corporate taxes all of a sudden now for a few years are reasonably low. Not the lowest, but reasonably low in the United States. And so which makes the United States so much more attractive to foreign direct investment. So you come to the United States, you may be paying a little bit less in corporate taxes. Like for comparison, in Germany, it's still close to 40%, 38. So countries like that. Canada now all of a sudden has higher corporate tax. So it definitely makes it a little bit more attractive for businesses to relocate to the United States. Now, talking about corporate taxes, here are some trends over time. So when you look at the trends over time, you see that taxes have been falling in every region. So corporate taxes, not that different overall by continent. So here you have different, you have continents, but you have EU only, you have BRICS only, you have Oceania, so basically, OECD, so which is the Organization of Economic Development, countries of economic development, so basically rich countries. So as you can see, it's about the same region by region, probably a little bit lower in Oceania, a little bit higher in the G7 countries, but going down rapidly in all cases. So from the 80s to the 90s, and then all the way to today, as you see, pretty much everyone went from about 40, 45 to about 25 or so. So basically taxes, corporate taxes fell from about 40% to about 20% in most of the regions of the world. So there is definitely a movement towards lower taxes globally. Now, let's take a look at some specific cases. So specific cases and specific theories. So here is a very interesting situation that we see in the United States and Mexico, or rather in the United States versus Mexico. So you see a lot of these so-called maquiladoras. So those would be like industrial parks built in Mexico. But as you can see, they're conspicuously close to the U.S. border. And there is a huge difference, like, one side is nearly empty and the other one is full of production facilities. What's going on here? Now, this is sort of a reason or result of uneven economic conditions and trade barriers. So as you know, the United States and Mexico and Canada are members of what used to be called NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. Now it's been renamed a couple of years ago under Trump into the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement. And so this is a free trade zone. So products made in Mexico can be freely sold in the United States or Canada and so on without any tariffs. And so what happens here is that many businesses, but in Mexico, as you saw in the previous slide here, let me repeat, show that in Mexico, taxes used to be lower, corporate taxes and personal taxes are also substantially lower. And then more importantly, labor costs are cheaper, right? And so what happens here is that many foreign manufacturers of, for example, cars or whatever other products might be, like, for example, Hyundai or Toyota, often set up shop in Mexico for the reason that the taxes were a little bit lower and labor was cheaper, but with the purpose of selling that product in the United States. And so they build the factories as close as possible to the U.S. border so that it's closer for the actual transportation, of the finished product. And so you would see them on the Mexican side to tap into the lower regulations and cheaper labor, but close enough to the United States so that the transportation cost is lower. In fact, in San Diego area, you would see a lot of these industrial parks on the Mexican side, and so many of the executives, they would actually live in the United States, but they would cross the border each day to go to work and then come back to the United States at the end of the day. So they find it sort of more comfortable to live in the United States, but they would work in Mexico. You can do that. And so that's one of the reasons why they're so close to the border. So that's basically how it works. Now, let's take a look here at some other reasons when it comes to countries and choices of where you want to be, but this time based on country brands. So for some products, the country of origin sort of matters. Probably the best example would be Switzerland. So Swiss watches, as we talked in the past, mine is not a Swiss watch. But if it were a Swiss watch, it probably would cost a 4-figure and maybe even 5 figures. So like thousands of dollars, right? Mine is like $300. It's a South Korean Samsung Galaxy watch, nothing special. But Swiss watches, even though they're not any more accurate than my South Korean watch, but people see some value in the fact that it's made in Switzerland. And so many companies would be willing and interested in being in Switzerland so that they can put on their product made in Switzerland. And all of a sudden they can charge much, much more for their product because the consumers, it's, the brand of the country sort of rubs onto the brand of the product. In fact, one of my students, PhD students, did a study some years ago where we wanted to see how the country image affects the perception of quality of the product. And so we did an experiment. She did an experiment. I only helped with the data collection a little bit. But so the experiment went like this. We had students from all around the world. Those were the X-Culture students from my project. And so we would show them advertisements for different product. And I think we had clothing, we had wine, we may have had something else there. And so the respondent would see the ad for the product. But in one condition, it would say, for example, the product is made in Italy. And in the other condition, it would be the product is made in China. And so the picture is exactly the same. Like it would be a model wearing, for example, some shoes, or a model wearing some watches, or not even a model, just a picture of a bottle of wine or whatever that might be. And so, or some other drink. And so then the question was, how much would you be willing to pay for the product? How would you rate the quality of the product and things like that? And even though the picture is identical, it's exactly precisely the same picture, but people who saw the products from some countries versus from others would rate some countries much better than others. Like there was a substantial difference. So the brand of the country did have an effect on the perception of the product itself. And so here is a rating of the country brands around the world. And so the United States now has the highest value of the brand, but then some other countries also are very popular. And in fact, China now has quite a valuable brand. So we used to know China as a maker of cheap, sort of low quality products. but not anymore. So now all of a sudden, if you have made in China, in many cases, it's actually perceived as high quality. And so Japan, obviously, Germany, obviously have very, very high status. I'm not sure why Switzerland is not on the list, so I would put it there as well. But, you have sort of the usual suspects, the United States, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom. So those countries have a very strong brand, right? So that is a big deal. Although, again, for some brands, you probably want to be like, for example, Switzerland. So that would be wise. So it would give you immediately some recognizable sort of brand associated with the product. What's interesting, again, I've heard that from a friend of mine who said or asked me, have you ever seen a product made in Israel? And I was like, yeah, I don't recall. I don't know. I mean, I know they have a very strong, viable economy and they do all kinds of things, but I don't recall seeing a product made in Israel. And he said that in many parts of the world, Israel, sort of, many countries have anti-Semitic sort of sentiments. And so they wouldn't be willing to buy a product from, for example, Israel. And so what many Israeli companies do is they register their companies overseas. And so this way they can sort of disguise the country of origin and basically have like a Czech company or Polish company or Swiss company for that matter. So that's another sort of here, more of a political reason. So unfortunately, the world is prejudiced. And so that's how some companies have to cope with it to deal with the problem. Now, another strategy would be, or another reason or factor that it drives foreign direct investment is vertical integration. So especially depending on the time, it's a different industry, but often there would be a movement towards sort of consolidating the full production cycle under one company's sort of umbrella. And so we saw that a lot happening in the 80s and the 90s in the oil business. So in the United States, if you go back in time like 30, 40 years ago, you will notice that most of the gas stations were small, privately owned shops. So Bob's Corner Gas, Tim's Gas, or whatever the names could be. And so each gas station would be owned by a different owner, by a different person, and many of them would be just this one single brand, single gas station in the state or in the country. And now we had some set of companies that would be extracting oil, like ExxonMobil, for example, Shell. Then other companies would be moving the crude oil. So big tanker companies, companies that own tankers, so they would move that stuff to the refineries. Then the refineries would be owned by someone else. Then the trucks that move the gas from refineries to gas stations, and then gas stations would be owned by someone else. But the energy companies, oil and gas companies, quickly figured out that they can make more money by consolidating the whole process under the same company. And so we saw a lot of this so-called vertical integration, where ExxonMobil, for example, started buying not only the oil rigs, but also oil tankers and oil refineries and trucks that move the products, gas, refined products, and then finally the gas stations. And so now when you are in the United States, you will see that most of the gas stations in the country are owned by one of a handful of brands, ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, and so on. And almost always it would be the same company that did the exploration, did the extraction, did the transportation, did the refinement, did the transportation again, and then finally the retail of gas. So it would be the same company. And as that vertical integration was happening, a lot of FDI was happening too. So the companies would be buying sites where you can extract oil. They would be building or buying refineries. They would be building or buying and setting up companies that move oil and so on and so on. So a lot of a lot of FDI was happening at that time. So when it comes to integration or FDI in general, you have some choices to make here. So you can choose to create a company from scratch in a foreign market. So that would be what we call greenfield investment. So presumably there is a green field, even though in reality it may not be green. But let's say you have a green field, you come with your money, you hire a construction crew, and you build this whole factory or refinery or store or whatever that might be. So that's your sort of, initial investment. Or you can do a merger. Maybe there was someone doing business already in the country, but you merge. You contribute capital, or you contribute maybe some know-hows or some patents, or you contribute some managerial expertise, and so together you create a company. Or you can do an acquisition. So in this case, you come and you buy an existing company, and so you have it that way. And so here you have essentially, which one is better, which one you want to do. And the difference usually is sort of a trade-off between risk and control. On the one hand, if you do a greenfield investment, you have ultimate control. You can build that factory or that restaurant or that store the way you like it, to your design, the way you want it. You can select the people that you want. You can train them the way you want. So you have ultimate control. But you also assume ultimate risk, and it may take a long time. So by the time you build your factory, it may have been several years, and by that time, maybe it's not even viable or relevant anymore. Whereas an acquisition, or a merger for that matter, is a much faster process. You come, you find something that you need, you buy, and you're basically ready to do business the next day. It may still take a few weeks or a few months, but it's a much faster process. But you lose much of the control. Maybe the building is not built to your specifications, and you do not have control of that. If it's a merger, you have a partner, you have to sort of deal with the partner. And again, sometimes it may not be something you want. So obviously it makes things more complicated. And so that's the trade-off. Now, let's talk about the United States specifically. And again, if you're not from the United States, one of my students are from a different country, or if you happen to be in a different country. So we go back to the question that I asked you earlier. Is FDI good or bad? And again, to make it more relevant, more sort of proximal to a specific country, let's say America, the United States. So is FDI good or bad for the United States? And so to a large extent, the question or the answer to that question depends on what the reasons are for your relocation or for your FDI. So sometimes it may be not really bad per se, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it may be seen as a loss for the home country. So if an American company decides to build a factory, for example, in Brazil, to many Americans, it will sound like a betrayal. So instead of creating jobs in the United States, you chose to create jobs in Brazil. And many will see that as traitorous. In fact, if you have seen the movie by Michael Moore, what is it, Bill and I, or Bob and I, GM's general manager, I forgot the name. But the whole movie was about sort of Flint, Michigan, and how many automakers that had factories in Flint, Michigan, literally packed them and moved them to Mexico. And so the whole documentary is about the impact it had on the cities in Michigan, in particular Flint, and the impact was devastating. So it was really, whole towns depended on the presence of those factories there. So like most of the jobs in town were at that factory. And when that factory packs and goes to a different country, then the community really struggles economically. And then in the documentary, Michael Moore took somebody who used to work at I think it was GM factory in Flint, Michigan, and was trying to get this person his job back in Mexico. So they literally wanted to apply for the job in Mexico. So, but in any case, in a situation like this, many people would be prone to see that as a negative development. Although there used to be a saying, you don't hear that anymore, but there used to be a saying that went like this: if it's good for GM, it's good for America. And so essentially, if you believe in the invisible hand of market, if you believe in free market, if you believe in free managerial choice and enterprise, then presumably GM, which is part of America, GM did some analysis, and if they decided that it would be beneficial for them to move to Mexico, then it's good for them. And if it's good for them, maybe it's good for America. An American company found a way to be more profitable. Shouldn't it be good? But again, I'm not sure if that argument would be bought by many people in an extreme case like I described. But there are many cases when actually many people wouldn't have a problem with relocation or investment in foreign countries. And so here are some of the examples. Like, for example, so-called a sunset industry relocation. So often when the product becomes outdated, when the demand for the product dwindles, when people in your country don't want that product anymore, it might make sense to relocate your production to the countries where that product is still popular. So for example, Volkswagen Beetle. So when the car was getting too old in Europe, Volkswagen, instead of shutting down the factories altogether, they decided to keep making money on this product, but elsewhere. And so they remained quite popular in Brazil. So Volkswagen moved some production to Brazil in the 80s. Then they had a few years when they ended the production in 1986, but then they reopened it again in 1993 and continued making those Volkswagen Beetles in Brazil up until 1996, long after the product was not anymore in demand in Germany. And so in this case, it's actually a positive development because Volkswagen, a German company, found a way to keep making money on something that the consumers didn't want in Germany anymore. But since Latin America was very eager to buy those Volkswagen Beetles, in a way, it was a good development for Germany because a German company was making money overseas, selling the product where it's in demand. Why not? So it was not needed in Germany anymore. And then obviously cost savings. So when GM relocated much of its production or some of its production from the United States to Mexico, it sounds like a betrayal of the American consumers and American taxpayers and American workers. But again, GM is a for-profit company. GM is not a charity. GM is not sort of a governmental agency whose job is to keep unemployment low in the United States. GM is a private for-profit business. And so for-profit businesses, that obliged by their charter to the stakeholders to return profits. And so if you can save costs by making your cars in Mexico and as a result sell more of them, have higher profits, why not? Again, if you believe in the free market, so the main foundation is that in the pursuit of individual economic interests, we benefit the whole of society. And so if I found a way to save costs, that's to my benefit. And if it's to my benefit, according to Adam Smith and the economic thinking in general, capitalist economic thinking, it should be good for everyone. So why not? Access to natural resources. Again, we talked about that as well. So sometimes it's simply you may need a lot of, let's say, heavy components. Like, you may need to be close to where iron is being mined, or you may be close to where, you have a lot of cheap energy, or you may need to be close to where you can get all those, rare earth materials, minerals. And so again, in that case, you might need to be, for example, in China. So that's also a viable reason why a company might want to be overseas. Relocation sometimes happens also due to access to the knowledge and networks. Again, so if you need to be where the expertise is, maybe such a relocation is totally justifiable. If you make movies, you probably want to be in Hollywood. If you make cars, you probably want to be close to Detroit. If you want to make medical equipment, you probably want to be in Massachusetts or maybe in North Carolina. So those kinds of relocations for companies from other countries make total sense. So if you are an IT company, you probably want to set up shop in the Silicon Valley. Makes perfect sense. So for American companies, again, if you need some sort of industrial expertise, Germany or Japan or maybe now China may be the place where you want to be. So all of those would be sort of viable reasons because otherwise you may go out of market. Sometimes you might want to set up shop in a foreign market sort of with the goal of increasing purchasing power in that market. Like, for example, many American companies that operated in China, they not only created jobs there, but they also created consumers there. Like, for example, the presence of big giants such as GM, for example, in China or in Mexico, not only made or allowed them to be closer to consumers, but also allowed them to create paying consumers in those markets. And so if they made cars in the United States, not only it would have been more expensive to make, and then you have to add the transportation to that, but also your consumers may not simply have the money to buy it. But if you operate large enough businesses in the target markets, that also increases their purchasing power, making it also easier for them to for the customers to buy the product, and so as a result, your profits improve. Political influence would be also one of the reasons. So allegedly, and I'm not sure if it's part of the strategy, it seems like it's not even sort of a secret anymore. But yes, China sets up a lot of businesses in other countries, also including for the reasons of political influence. You sort of, offer credits, offer, services of your companies. And so over time, the recipient sort of becomes dependent on your business. And as a result, you may later ask for some political favors. Allegedly, many countries do it. So again, I don't want to pick up on China here because China is not unique in any way. So before it was Japan that was expanding, including economically, the Netherlands, obviously, for centuries before that, South Korea, Russia. So it's a viable strategy. And so as you build those bridges to other countries, you also can exert some political influence through it. Now, so is it good when a company builds, for example, factory in your country? So is it good for America when a foreign company opens a shop in America? And again, most people see that as a positive development. It's an investment. We create jobs in the country. Sure, we want foreigners come and do business in the United States. But if it's done on a large scale, many people feel a little uneasy about it. So when Lenovo bought IBM, I remember it was 2001, if I remember correctly, or maybe 2002. I remember many people felt like something bad had happened. So what's going on? The Chinese are buying American companies? What's going on? When India's Tata bought Jaguar and Land Rover. So again, many Brits felt like it was a negative development. These are sort of icons of the British or American industry, and all of a sudden now they've been bought by countries that, at least at that time, many saw as, inferior or less developed. And so how come Indians are buying British brands? So likewise now, when the investment comes, for example, from, it used to be in the 80s from Japan and then later from China. So again, many see that as infringement on American sort of business. If you watched Back to the Future, Part 2, so as you remember, at that time they thought that the Japanese will soon conquer the world. And so in that movie in 2015, presumably the boss and everything was Japanese owned. So nobody sort of, expected that it would change. But at that time, that was the sentiment. And at that time in the United States, there was this big concern that maybe, the Japanese come into the United States, opening businesses here. It would be sort of a form of modern economic colonialism. And so not everyone was happy about that or saw that as a positive development. So now let's imagine a specific situation. So in 2009, GM went through bankruptcy, and there were talks at some point about a possibility of Toyota buying out GM. And it didn't happen, but if it did, so if Toyota bought GM, would that be good for America or bad for America? So when I ask my students that, many of them say that maybe it would be bad. Like, we want the American largest automaker to be American. And so if the Japanese bought it, many Americans sort of, well, maybe it's a problem. Maybe we don't want it. And so here, most people, when I ask this question, they think about it emotionally. So they think about it, how do I feel about it? But if I ask them why, so why do you feel that way? Most people cannot articulate the reasons. Most people cannot explain why they feel good or bad about a foreign company buying a business in your country. And so here is a sort of framework for how you can think about it. So it's hard to say if it's good or bad in general, but what if I ask you, Toyota buying GM, how would that impact employment in the United States? Would it create more jobs or fewer jobs? How would it impact prices? How would it impact internal consumptions? Like, would Americans buy more or fewer cars? Quality of the cars. internal revenue, basically taxes. Would there be more taxes paid into the U.S. budget or not? A standard of living for the U.S. employees or for Americans in general, political influence in the world of the United States, national security. So all of those are actually answerable questions. So all of those are questions that we can talk about more from the sort of logical, analytical point of view, as opposed to purely emotional point of view. And so let's think about those things. So employment. Well, in fact, I have a table here. So let's take a look at the table here. So employment. Well, if the factories are owned by Toyota or if the factories are owned by GM, chances are employment probably will not change much. If the company is going through some bad times, no matter who the owner is, probably some people will be fired, laid off. If the company is doing well, maybe people will be hired. But there is really no reason to believe that GM will employ more people than Toyota or the other way around. Possibly there will be some expatriates from Japan, maybe managers, and if so, maybe some people will, managers will lose their jobs, but all in all, there shouldn't be huge difference. Taxes, again, if the amount of production and sales doesn't really change, taxes will be roughly the same too. Operating expenses, I don't know. I mean, maybe Toyota would be more efficient, but GM is doing a pretty good job. Again, there seems to be no reason to believe that will change. Research and development, both companies are very innovative. Again, no reason to believe that there will be a huge difference. Demand created by the employees of the company, well, if the number of employees is about the same, I don't really see any difference. Maybe there will be some difference in net profit repatriation, meaning that if the owners are Japanese, whatever profits they have, they may take with them to Japan. But again, I don't think the difference will be that substantial. First of all, many rich Americans invest their money in foreign companies anyway, like buy stocks and buy property overseas. And I don't really think, and many rich Japanese probably buy property and investments in the United States. So all in all, I don't think it would matter. I mean, it matters more as to what the company will do, the new owner of the company will do. But I don't see why it should be substantially different one versus the other. So when we think about it more from the analytic point of view, there is really probably no difference to believe that there will be a big difference depending on who owns the company. So if it did come to Toyota buying GMC, probably not a bad thing, meaning that, well, if GMC is not doing well and Toyota sees a way forward, why not? China, like for example, if it was BYD buying GM, I suspect many people will get a little bit less comfortable with that. So the stereotype, substantiated or not, I'm not sure, but the stereotype seems to be that China exerts or is on a mission to become more influential and sometimes doesn't shy from using its influence and power. And so if China owned the biggest American automaker, many might see that as a national security matter. And so if so, many people would not be doing the calculations purely based on jobs created, but also what can be done with those jobs. And I suspect many people would be not comfortable with that. But equally so if the jobs went from, if an American company opened business in China, I suspect these days many Chinese may also see that as a national security threat. Or if an American company was opened in Russia, for example. Again, some Russians would not be comfortable with that, as would be the case the other way around. Now, for example, here I want to mention something like looking at the company at Nestlé, a Swiss company. So when Nestlé makes an investment overseas, I wonder if the Swiss citizens get upset about that and see that as a betrayal, as creating jobs elsewhere. But looking at Nestlé, so the company has only 2% of its revenue from Switzerland, and 5% of production happens in Switzerland. So the company basically makes almost all of its products overseas and sells pretty much all of it overseas. So would Switzerland be better off if Nestlé operated only in Switzerland, or at least made all the products only in Switzerland? Probably not. They definitely would not be as rich, as influential, as successful, as profitable if they were only in Switzerland. And so I would argue that Switzerland wins big time when Nestle decides to do business internationally, because the profits are so much greater. So you probably don't want to constrain the companies. But anyway, so these are some of the considerations that need to go into it. Now, sometimes a foreign company buying a company in your country may be a very, very negative thing. So, and here are a couple of examples from my own experience when that was a very negative thing. So in the 90s, when the Soviet Union had just collapsed, there was a factory in my town that was making high voltage switches. So like the switch that you have to switch on the lights in your room, in your house, those are very simple machines, easy to make, anyone can make them. But the high voltage switches, like the ones that are used, to switch off the electricity at high power lines, like when you have 20,000 volts going through the wire, those are extremely complicated machines because, once you have two wires close enough to one another, you have the spark and you basically have a welding machine, right? And so how do you switch something that, you go from disconnected to connected without creating the spark? And so those are complicated machines. They use some special oil, like it's a very complicated process. And so there was a factory that makes those switches in my hometown in Ukraine. And apparently it was like the third largest in the world. So the Soviet Union was obsessed with, economies of scale and big, gigantic production. And so we had a factory that made those specific voltage, high voltage switches, and it was one of the largest in the world. And so the Soviet Union collapses. The economy is in ruins. The inflation is in thousands of percent per year. And the business is going out of business. So, the factory is there, the workers are there. But in the Soviet Union, all of the supply chains, all of the distribution channels, all were sort of tied to this command economy. And so the Soviet Union is no more. And so all the chains are broken. And so the factory doesn't know how to stay in business because all of a sudden they cannot get the components, they cannot get the customers, so they're close to going bankrupt. And so ABB comes along. ABB is one of or maybe the world's largest manufacturer of all kinds of equipment, including these high voltage switches. And so they buy the factory in for some like absurd small amount, like $5 million, like for a price of a nice house today. So like very, very cheaply. But we are happy. So we think, this big brand, this big, international conglomerate comes and buys the factory. So that should be a good thing because, they will probably, turn it around and make it successful. And so they buy it. But the contract stipulations do not require anything of them with the expectation and hope that they will be interested in this company being profitable. They own it now. They want to make money. But no, what they do, they just come, they cut all of the equipment, they put it outside, exposed to the weather and elements, and just basically kill the factory and don't do it, like literally come, destroy, and don't do anything. And so in this case, as it became obvious later on, they just simply decided to kill the competitor. So they were able to get it extremely cheaply. They were able to kill it. The Ukraine, the Soviet Union before and then Ukraine later on were not the best places to do business. So the country was overregulated and, it was not a very good economic environment. And so rather than trying to turn it around and then deal with all the bureaucracy and whatever we had, the Soviet legacy, they felt it would be more beneficial just to kill the competitor and then basically take their market share. So obviously that was cheap way to kill a competitor for ABB, but not so much for the factory in Ukraine. So the workers of that factory, the city of the country. Another example is very different but sort of related, is the foreign direct investment coming from South Korea again into Ukraine. So Ukraine had a couple of automakers during the Soviet times, and so the biggest one was ZAZ, Zaporizhsky Avtozavod. So it was located in central Ukraine, making some sort of smaller cars, and then all kinds of other things later on. But anyway, they decided to create a joint venture with Daewoo, which was one of Korea's, the third largest Korean automaker. So they had Hyundai and Kia, which and they had also Daewoo. Daewoo was making some air and space equipment and, spaceships or something like that. But also they were making cars. And so they come to Ukraine and they say, we would like to basically create a joint venture with your automaker, with ZAZ. And so this time Ukrainians are very sort of cognizant of the possibility of, hostile takeover to kill the competitor, even though in this case, unlike the high voltage switches, which like there are 5 companies in the whole world that make it, here you have dozens and dozens of automakers around the world. So it's not so much a concern that the Koreans will come and kill this Ukrainian automaker, but they still want to make sure that the company is viable. And so they had all kinds of conditions, such as you must keep so many employees, you must make certain investment into the company. So they have all kinds of, conditions written down in the contract. All sounds good. But the Koreans are also sort of smart, and they say, well, if we make all those investments, and if we make all those promises as to the amount, number of employees and things like that, we want some concessions too. And so the Koreans said that they wanted some discounts when it comes to the taxes, but they also wanted to basically have a monopolistic condition, situation in the country. So they lobbied for huge import tariffs on imported cars. So, and the Ukrainian government, interested in success of the automotive industry in the country, they said, sure, let's do it. And so what happened was that the Koreans did not have any incentives to develop the business. Why would you? You are the only one making cars in the whole country of, at that time, 52 million people, gigantic country, the largest in Europe by territory and like the 3rd largest by population. You virtually have no competition because high import taxes on foreign-made cars from Germany, from Japan, from the United States makes them too expensive. So you are in a very advantageous position, and you pay you get all kinds of lower taxes, tax holidays, and things like that. And so what happened was that for a while it seemed like it was going well, but then they never innovated. They never started making new models. They were stuck with the Slanos, and I forgot what was the name of the other one, Nanza, something like that. And so they didn't have to, because you are the monopoly. You can sell old, outdated, obsolete cars, and people will buy them because they don't have anything else, or they have to pay a lot for anything else. And so in a way, they bankrupted the factory. So they were making some cars, but they were like outdated, obsolete cars. Quality was not there. Why would you do that? Why would you invest money when you can still sell expensive, outdated stuff? And so that was not a very good development. And so again, that's not the kind of FDI that you want, right? So let's conclude this lecture. And I want to conclude with this ironic statement that even though FDI is good, so usually trade is good, international foreign direct investment is good, international trade is good, but the irony is that often it is not condoned or enjoyed or supported by both countries where the foreign direct investment goes from and countries where it goes to. Just like with international trade, people tend to not like it. So when a U.S. company buys a factory in Mexico, is it good or bad? Well, the irony is that both Americans and Mexicans tend to see that as a bad development. So Americans tend to hate it because they see that a factory in Mexico is not a factory in the United States. So an American company is behaving unpatriotically and opens businesses and creates jobs in Mexico, which they see as a bad development. But in Mexico, often people don't like that either. So they see that as there was a Mexican company, an American company came and bought it, so all of a sudden they're buying our businesses. Now it's all owned by foreigners, so the foreigners get all of the profits. And so they also see that as, a neo-expansionism or neo-colonialism. And so they don't like it either. And so obviously, there is some logical contradiction here, but that's how often things go. And so just like with international trade, FDI often is sort of universally hated by all sides of the story. But then again, if you look at it economically, just like we discussed today, it may not be such a bad thing. So it may actually be positive for everyone. And if you believe in the free market mantra that in the pursuit of individual economic interests would benefit the larger society, then yes, why not? It seems like a good development. I'm going to leave you at that. Thank you for your attention. And I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about FDI, what you think about it, good, bad, who wins, who loses. Write to me when you have a second.